Black girl gave her last meal to a hungry Hell's Angel. At dawn, 300 bikers surrounded her home, the last plate of Gran. At 5:47 in the morning, before the sun had even decided to show its face over East Dayton, Ohio, 300 headlights came rolling down Xenia Avenue like a river of fire. Engines growled low and steady, one after another, until the whole street shook. Porch windows rattling, dogs howling 3 blocks over, an old man's coffee cup trembling on his kitchen table. Neighbors who hadn't been up that early since Y2K threw back their curtains and stood there in their bathrobes, mouths hanging open, watching leather-clad men and women fill every inch of pavement in front of one small white house. And on the porch of that house stood a 19-year-old girl in pajama pants, her hand pressed hard over her mouth, tears running down her face. Not from fear. From something she didn't have a name for yet. That girl was Imani Beauvais. And to understand why 300 bikers showed up at her door at dawn, you have to go back 4 days. You have to go back to a Tuesday night, an empty refrigerator, and the last plate of food in the house. Now let the record show. Imani Beauvais was not a girl who asked for help. Not once. Not ever, if she could help it. She'd learned that from her mother. Marie-Claude Beauvais had been a trauma nurse, the kind who worked double shifts and still came home with enough love left over to braid her daughter's hair before bed. She used to say, in her thick Haitian lilt, "Nous pas mande, nous bay." We don't ask. We give. Even when we have next to nothing, we find a way to give something. Marie-Claude had been gone 3 years now. A drunk driver on I-75 took her home on a rainy October night and left Imani, 16 at the time, alone with a grandmother whose lungs were failing and a house that suddenly felt like it had 10,000 pounds sitting on its roof. Imani grew up fast after that. She dropped out of community college after 1 semester because the bus fare to campus cost more than she could spare. She picked up double shifts at Odessa's diner on Xenia Avenue, refilling coffee cups for truckers and pouring grits for old deacons who called her baby girl and left dollar tips folded like little apologies. She came home every night smelling like bacon grease and dish soap, and she sat by her grandmother's bed and read psalms out loud until Gran Solene's breathing slowed into sleep. Gran Solene, Marie-Claude's mother, had raised Imani those last 3 years, the best a woman with failing lungs and shaking hands could manage. She couldn't cook anymore, couldn't climb the porch steps without stopping twice to catch her breath. But she could still talk, still pray, still reach out with those thin fingers and squeeze Imani's hand tight enough to say, "I see what you're carrying, child, and I'm proud of you without a single word." What neither of them said out loud, not once, not to each other, was how close they were to losing the house. The little white house on Cherry Blossom Lane had belonged to Marie-Claude, paid for in cash, dollar by dollar, over 11 years of double shifts. It was the only thing of her mother's that Imani had left that she could touch, that she could stand inside of, that still smelled, faintly in the closets, like her mother's perfume. And the property tax bill sitting unpaid on the kitchen counter said, in black and white, that Imani had 14 days left to find $2,340 or the county was going to take it. She didn't have 234, let alone 10 times that. She'd tried the bank. Tried a payday loan place that made her stomach turn just walking through the door. Tried, God help her, to swallow her pride and call her mother's old church, New Hope Missionary Baptist, and ask if there was a benevolence fund. The woman on the phone had been kind enough, but the fund, she said, was tapped out till spring. So Imani did the only thing left to do. She worked, and she prayed. And she told herself, the way her mother had taught her, that God didn't bring you to a River Jordan without a way across. That Tuesday night, the cupboards were bare. Not needs a grocery run bare. Bare like a Bible verse. 1/2 bag of rice. A dented can of black beans that had been rolling around the back of the pantry so long the label had faded. A little dried thyme. That was it. That was the whole of what stood between the Beauvais women and an empty stomach. Imani made it stretch the only way she knew how. The way Gran had taught her on nights just as thin as this one, years back in Port-au-Prince before either of them ever set foot on American soil. Diri ak pois. Rice and beans, cooked slow, seasoned with what little there was, until it tasted like something more than what it actually was. She was standing at the stove, stirring, when she heard the sound outside. Not a car. A motorcycle, the big kind, loud enough to rattle the window glass, sputtering, coughing, and then dying somewhere near the curb. Imani turned the burner down low and moved to the window, careful, the way you learn to be careful in a neighborhood where trouble sometimes rode in on two wheels after dark. What she saw through the gap in the curtains made her breath catch. A man, big, broad-shouldered, gray beard down to his collarbone, a leather vest covered in patches she didn't recognize, tattoos crawling up both forearms. He was on one knee beside his bike in the gutter light, one hand pressed to his ribs, and even from the porch she could see the dark stain spreading through his shirt. Her first instinct, the smart one, the safe one, was to lock the door and call it in. Her second instinct was her mother's voice. Nu pamande. Nu bay. Lord help me, Imani muttered to herself, and before she could talk herself out of it, she had the porch light on and the door cracked open. Sir? Sir, are you all right? The man looked up at her, and even hurting the way he clearly was, there was something careful, almost gentle, in the way he held himself back from the porch steps, like a man raised right, not wanting to scare a young woman standing alone in her doorway at night. Sorry, miss, he rasped. Bike threw the chain about a mile back. Went down hard trying to keep it upright. Didn't mean to come up on your street like this. Just need a minute to catch my breath, and if you got water, I'd be obliged. His name, she'd learned soon enough, was Roscoe Rook Halloran, 58 years old, a mechanic by trade, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, and the road captain of a motorcycle club most folks in Dayton had never heard of, and if they had, probably feared for all the wrong reasons, the Iron Shepherds. But right then, on Imani's porch, he was just a hurt stranger bleeding through his shirt at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She should have shut the door. Every voice of caution in her head told her to. Instead, she found herself stepping out onto the porch, wrapping her arm under his good side and half walking, half hauling 210 pounds of stunned biker up her front steps and into her kitchen. You don't gotta do this, Rook said, wincing as she eased him into a chair. I know I don't, Imani said. Hold still. She'd learned first aid from her mother the way some kids learn cursive, early and by necessity. She cleaned the gash along his ribs with peroxide from under the sink, taped gauze over it tight enough to slow the bleeding, and only then did she notice him looking. Not at her, but past her, at the small pot still simmering on the stove. That smells like my grandmother's kitchen, he said quietly. Ain't had rice and beans cooked slow like that since I was a boy in Georgia. Imani followed his eyes to the pot, to the very last food in the house. She thought about the empty cupboards, about the 14 days on the tax notice, about how tomorrow, after her shift, there'd be nothing waiting for her and Grand Solène but whatever she could stretch from a near-bare pantry and a prayer. And then she thought about her mother's voice again. We don't ask. We give. Without letting herself think twice, Imani stood, took down Grand's old blue enamel plate, the one with the little chip on the rim, the one that had been in the family longer than Imani had been alive, and spooned onto it the last of what the Beauvais house had to offer. She set it down in front of a stranger she'd known for 11 minutes. Eat, she said. You need it more than the pot does tonight. Rook stared at that plate a long moment. Then he looked up at her and something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked for just a second like recognition. Like he was seeing a ghost standing in that kitchen. But he didn't say anything about it. Not yet. Miss, he said instead, voice rough, you don't know what you just did. I know exactly what I did, Imani said, managing a tired smile. I fed a hungry man. My mama would have done the same. She didn't know, sitting there watching a wounded biker eat the last meal in her house, that her front window had a witness. 2 doors down, behind lace curtains yellowed by cigarette smoke, Phoebe Anderson stood with her phone already in her hand, thumb moving fast across the screen, typing out a message to the New Hope prayer chain that would, by morning, turn one act of mercy into the talk of the whole street. Y'all better start praying for that Beauvais girl, she typed. She done brought some kind of gang member into her house at this hour. Lord knows what's about to happen on this block." Phoebe hit send and pressed her lips into a thin, satisfied line, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has decided, long before the facts arrive, exactly what story she intends to tell. She had her reasons, though she'd never have called them that. 3 years back, Phoebe Anderson had lost her own mother's house 2 streets over. Lost it to the county, to back taxes, to a system that didn't care how long a family had lived somewhere. She'd watched strangers move furniture out onto the curb while she stood on the sidewalk crying, and nobody, not one soul from that church, had come to stand beside her. And here was this girl, half her age, somehow still holding on to her mama's house. Still, in Phoebe's eyes, walking around with her head held high like the world owed her something. It didn't occur to Phoebe that jealousy dressed up as concern is still jealousy. It rarely does. Back inside, Rook finished the plate slower than he needed to, like a man trying to make a good thing last. When he was done, he set the fork down gentle, the way you'd set down something precious, and looked at Imani with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What's your last name, miss, if you don't mind my asking?" "Beauvais," she said. "Imani Beauvais." Something shifted in the big man's face, a stillness, like he'd just heard a name he'd carried in his chest a long, long time. "Beauvais," he repeated, low. "Your mother. Was her name Marie-Claude?" Imani's whole body went cold and still at once. "How do you know my mother's name?" Rook Halloran didn't answer right away. He reached instead into the inside pocket of his vest, slow, careful, like a man handling something sacred, and pulled out a folded, sun-faded photograph, its edges soft from being carried for years. He set it on the kitchen table between them. It was a photo of a hospital ward, beds in rows, and in the center of it a young Haitian nurse in scrubs, laughing at something off-camera, her hand resting on the shoulder of a soldier lying in the bed beside her. A soldier with the same gray eyes, the same set jaw as the man sitting in Imani's kitchen right now, 14 years younger and very much alive because of the woman standing next to him. Imani's hands began to shake. That's my mother," she whispered. "Where did you—" "Landstuhl, Germany," Rook said, his voice thick now, unsteady in a way it hadn't been even with a bleeding wound in his side. 2011. I came off a medevac out of Kandahar with a chest full of shrapnel and about 6 minutes of blood left in me, near as they could tell. Your mama was the trauma nurse on that ward. She didn't stop working on me even after the doctor said it wasn't worth the effort. She held my hand and she told me, in that voice of hers, 'Soldier, you are not done yet, and I am not letting go of you.' And she didn't." He looked up, and his eyes were wet now, no shame in it at all. "I've spent 14 years trying to find that woman Miss Beauvais, 14 years wanting to say thank you proper. Never could track her down, moved around too much, lost the paper trail more than once. And tonight my chain throws loose a mile from a house I ain't never seen before in my life, and I stumble up onto the porch of the one woman on God's green earth who could still be carrying her name." He looked down at the empty blue plate. "And she feeds me. Last of what she's got, and she don't even know who I am yet. That's your mama in you, girl. That is your mama, sure as I'm sitting here." Imani sat down hard in the kitchen chair across from him, her legs no longer willing to hold her up. "She died 3 years ago," she managed. "Car accident." Rook closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, there was grief there. Real grief. For a woman he'd only known across the span of one hospital bed all those years ago, and had never stopped being grateful to. "Then I'm about 14 years too late to pay her back proper," he said quietly. "But I'll be damned. Beg your pardon, if I'm too late to pay it back to her daughter." Imani opened her mouth to say she didn't need anything, that she was fine, that her mother's memory was payment enough all on its own. The same words she'd been saying to everyone, including herself, for 3 straight years. But something in Rook Halloran's face told her that this particular man was not going to accept "I'm fine" for an answer. He pulled out his phone, thumb moving over the screen with the same careful deliberateness he'd used with the photograph, and typed a single message to a group chain 300 names long. "Found her. Marie Claude's girl. She's in trouble and doesn't know we're coming. Church parking lot, 5 a.m. Bring what you can spare. This one's for the nurse who wouldn't let go. He looked up at Imani, who had no idea yet what those words meant, no idea what was about to descend on Cherry Blossom Lane before the sun came up. Get some sleep, Miss Beauvais, Rook said, rising slow off the kitchen chair, testing his ribs, wincing but steady. You're going to want to be rested for what's coming. What's coming? Imani asked, bewildered. Rook Halloran paused in her doorway, looked back at the empty blue plate still sitting on the table between them, and allowed himself, for the first time that night, a small and certain smile. Family, he said simply, whether you know it yet or not. And then he was gone into the dark, engine roaring back to life despite the damage, tail light shrinking down Cherry Blossom Lane, leaving Imani standing alone in her kitchen with an empty plate, an empty pantry, and a feeling in her chest she couldn't yet put a name to. She had no way of knowing that 2 doors down, Phoebe Anderson's message was already spreading through the prayer chain like wildfire, twisting into something uglier with every retelling. She had no way of knowing that across town, a county assessor named Dwight Kessler was about to see tomorrow's neighborhood gossip and recognize, with the cold calculation of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of excuse, the perfect opportunity to finally take the one house on Cherry Blossom Lane that had been sitting stubbornly outside his reach. And she had no way of knowing that in 4 days' time, 300 motorcycles would fill her street from end to end, headlights blazing in the dark before dawn, not to bring trouble to her door, but to answer a debt 14 years overdue. Imani stood a long while at the kitchen window after he left, watching the empty street where his tail light had disappeared, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of a story Grand Solène used to tell about angels arriving disguised as travelers, testing the hearts of the people whose doors they knocked on. She'd always thought it was just an old woman's way of teaching a child to be kind to strangers. Standing there now, staring at an empty pot and an empty plate, and a strange, unfamiliar lightness in her chest, she wasn't so sure anymore that it was only a story. She washed the pot, wiped down the counter, and went to check on Grand Solène one last time before bed. The old woman was already asleep, her breathing slow and even, one hand resting on the worn Bible she kept on her nightstand. Imani stood in the doorway a moment watching her, thinking about how much her grandmother had already lost, a husband, a country, a daughter, and how she had never once, in 3 years of watching her carry all of it, heard the woman complain. Some people just know how to keep giving, Imani thought, even after the world's taken almost everything from them. She didn't sleep easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph Rook had shown her, her mother's face, younger than Imani had ever known her, laughing in a hospital ward half a world away, one hand resting on the shoulder of a soldier. Neither of them could have known would show up bleeding on her porch 14 years later. It felt less like coincidence and more like a thread that had been pulled taut across an ocean in half a lifetime, finally drawing itself tight. All she knew, standing in her kitchen at 10:30 that Tuesday night, was that she'd given away the last food in the house to a stranger. And for the first time in 3 long years, Imani Beauvais did not feel like she was carrying the weight of that house alone. What the street saw. By 7 o'clock Wednesday morning, the story of what happened on Cherry Blossom Lane had already traveled farther and changed more shapes than Imani Beauvais could have imagined. Phoebe Anderson's late-night message to the New Hope prayer chain had done exactly what she intended it to do, though even she might have been surprised at how fast it spread and how ugly it got along the way. By the time it reached Deacon Otis Freeman's phone, some kind of gang member had become a whole motorcycle gang. By the time it reached Sister Verlene Doss 2 blocks over, it had grown into Imani Beauvais done let some biker gang move right into her mama's house, Lord have mercy on that child. And by the time it landed, as these things always do, one way or another, in the inbox of Dwight Kessler, county property assessor, it had become something else entirely. An opportunity. Dwight Kessler had been an assessor for the county for 11 years, and for the last 4 of those years he had been running a very quiet, very profitable arrangement that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with his brother-in-law, Carl Whitfield, and a real estate holding company called Meridian Row Partners. The scheme was simple enough, if you had the stomach for it. Kessler oversaw property tax assessments across several East Dayton neighborhoods, blocks that had been, for decades, modest, black-owned, working-class streets like Cherry Blossom Lane, streets where a family might own a home outright, paid for over a decade of double shifts, but where a sudden spike in assessed value could turn a manageable tax bill into an impossible one almost overnight. Kessler had been quietly inflating those assessments, block by block, family by family, for going on 2 years now. Not enough to draw attention from any one household, just enough, spread wide across dozens of homes, to push a certain percentage of owners into default. And when a home went to tax foreclosure, Meridian Row Partners was always, conveniently, first in line with a lowball cash offer that looked like salvation to a desperate family and looked, on paper, like a very tidy flip to Carl Whitfield 6 months later. It was ugly, it was slow, and it had worked, quietly, on 11 houses so far without a single soul in county government asking a serious question. The house on Cherry Blossom Lane, the little white one with the herringbone porch railing that Marie-Claude Beauvais had paid for in cash, had been sitting on Kessler's list for over a year now, resisting every attempt at a market correction to its assessed value because Imani, against every odd, had somehow managed to scrape the payment together each cycle. Month after impossible month, until this cycle. This cycle. She was 14 days from default, and Kessler knew it, because Kessler kept very careful track of exactly which families were running out of road. And now, here was a rumor, a whole neighborhood buzzing about gang activity at that very address, landing in his lap like a gift from God himself, or whatever passed for God in Dwight Kessler's particular corner of the universe. He didn't need the rumor to be true. He only needed it to be useful. Kessler had a particular gift, honed over 11 years in county government, for finding the seam in a system and working it patiently, quietly, the way a man works a splinter loose from under his skin. He'd learned early that nobody questioned a form. Nobody double-checked an assessment as long as the numbers looked plausible enough on paper. Homeowners in neighborhoods like Cherry Blossom Lane rarely had the money for a lawyer, rarely knew they had the right to challenge a reassessment within 30 days, rarely even opened the notices in time to do anything but panic. He wasn't stealing houses, he told himself, on the rare nights his conscience stirred enough to require an explanation. He was simply correcting outdated valuations. The market decided the rest. It was easier to believe that story about himself than to sit with the alternative. That he had spent 4 years quietly making sure a dozen black families lost the one asset most of them would ever own, so that his brother-in-law could flip it for a profit 6 months later. By 9 that morning, Kessler had drafted a memo to his supervisor citing documented neighborhood concern regarding criminal activity at the Cherry Blossom Lane property, recommending an expedited compliance review that would, conveniently, accelerate the foreclosure timeline from 90 days to 14. 14 days. The exact number already ticking down on Imani's tax notice. He printed the notice himself. He'd deliver it personally, he decided. A nice touch. A chance to see the look on that girl's face when she realized just how fast the ground could disappear from under her. Imani had no idea any of this was happening. She spent that Wednesday the way she spent most of her days, up before dawn to check on Grand Selene, a full shift at Odessa's diner refilling coffee and carrying plates, and home again by mid-afternoon to sit by her grandmother's bed and read scripture until the old woman's breathing evened out into sleep. What she did notice, walking home from the bus stop, was the way Mrs. Verlene Doss crossed the street rather than pass in front of her house. The way 2 boys who used to wave at her from the Freeman porch just stared instead, whispering to each other. The way, when she stopped into the corner store for milk, the woman behind the register rang her up without a single word, without the usual, "How's your grandmother doing, baby?" that had been part of their routine for 3 years running. By the time she got home, she understood, with the particular sinking clarity of someone who has lived her whole life aware of how quickly a black woman's name can turn into a cautionary tale, that something had shifted on her street overnight, and that she was the reason. She found out what exactly when Phoebe Anderson stopped her on the sidewalk in front of her own house, arms crossed, face set in an expression that tried hard to look like concern, and mostly succeeded in looking like satisfaction. Imani, baby, I need to ask you something, Phoebe said, in the particular tone reserved for people who have already decided the answer. What in the world was that motorcycle man doing at your house last night? Whole street heard that engine. Whole street saw you letting him inside. He was hurt, Miss Phoebe, Imani said carefully. He needed help. I gave him some water and cleaned him up, that's all. That's all, Phoebe repeated, arching an eyebrow. Child, do you know what those motorcycle gangs do? Do you know what kind of man rides with a group like that? You're out here alone with your grandmother sick in that bed, and you're letting strange men into your house at night. He wasn't a stranger for long, Imani said, feeling her voice tighten. He knew my mother. That stopped Phoebe for half a second, but only half a second. Mm-hmm, she said, unconvinced, already turning to head back toward her own porch. I'm just saying what everybody's saying, baby. You be careful. This is a decent street. Folks around here have worked hard to keep it that way. Imani stood on the sidewalk a long moment after Phoebe walked off, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just hurt, but a specific, familiar exhaustion. The exhaustion of being watched, judged, and found wanting by people who had known her mother, who had eaten at her mother's table, who should have known better. She went inside and didn't cry. She'd learned, somewhere in the last 3 years, how to swallow that particular feeling and keep moving. She checked on Gran Solène, made a thin dinner from what little remained in the pantry, and told herself the whispering would die down in a day or two, the way it always did. She had no idea it was only the beginning. Thursday morning, Dwight Kessler himself walked up the porch steps of the little white house on Cherry Blossom Lane and taped a bright yellow notice to the front door. Imani found it when she left for her shift. Notice of Accelerated Compliance Review in county letterhead, informing her that due to documented concerns regarding property use and neighborhood safety, the standard 90-day grace period on her outstanding tax obligation had been reduced. She had, as of that morning, exactly 11 days to pay $2,340 in full, or the county would proceed with foreclosure and public auction of the property located at 214 Cherry Blossom Lane. Imani read it 3 times, standing on her own porch in her diner uniform, before the words fully landed. 11 days, not 90. 11. She called the county office from the bus stop, hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone twice, and got a clerk who read from a script and told her, not unkindly but not helpfully either, that concerns had been raised and the review had already been approved, and there was, unfortunately, no appeals process available on a timeline this short. She didn't cry on the bus. She held it together through her whole shift at Odessa's, pouring coffee with hands that trembled just slightly, smiling the tired smile that customers expected from her. And it wasn't until she got home that evening, until she was standing in her own kitchen staring at that yellow notice taped crooked to her own refrigerator, that the weight of it finally broke through. She sat down at the kitchen table, put her face in her hands, and for the first time in 3 years, Imani Beauvais let herself cry the way she hadn't allowed since the funeral. She didn't hear the knock at first. 3 soft raps, careful, deliberate. When she opened the door, wiping her face fast, trying to compose herself, she found Rook Halloran standing there again, this time without a scratch on him, dressed the same, but looking somehow entirely different, steadier, purposeful, carrying a worn manila folder under one arm. "Miss Beauvais," he said, and then he saw her face, saw the redness around her eyes, and his whole posture changed. What happened? She didn't mean to tell him. She'd meant to say she was fine, the way she always said she was fine. But something about the folder under his arm, something about the steady, grandfatherly patience in his face, cracked the door open, and it all came out. The tax notice, the accelerated timeline, Phoebe Anderson's gossip, the neighbors crossing the street, 11 days to find money that didn't exist. Rook listened to every word without interrupting once. When she finished, he set the folder down on the porch railing and was quiet for a long moment. 11 days, he said finally, low. And this all started the night after you patched me up on your kitchen table. I'm not blaming you, Imani said quickly. It's not your fault people around here decided to talk. No, Rook said. and something hard came into his voice now, something she hadn't heard from him before. But it is somebody's fault, and I got a feeling I know exactly whose name is on that notice. He opened the folder then, and Imani saw, for the first time, what he'd been carrying. Newspaper clippings, county records, a hand-drawn map of East Dayton with small red circles marking a cluster of addresses. 11 addresses, 11 houses, all in a 2-mile radius, all foreclosed on within the last 2 years, all later sold to the same holding company. Meridian Row Partners, Rook said, tapping the paper. My club does more than ride, Miss Beauvais. We look out for folks. Been keeping an eye on this particular pattern for about 8 months now, ever since one of our own, a widow out on 3rd Street, Miss Odalis Freeman's aunt, lost her house the same way you're about to lose yours. Fast-tracked review, vague neighborhood concerns. Same assessor's signature every single time. Man named Dwight Kessler. Imani's stomach turned over. That's the man who taped the notice to my door. I know, Rook said grimly, because that's the name that's on every single one of these 11 files. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The porch light buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed. I don't understand, Imani finally said. Why my house? I've never even met this man before yesterday. Because you're the 12th, Rook said quietly, and because for once, somebody handed him a reason folks would believe. Gossip about a motorcycle gang parked outside your door. That's exactly the kind of cover story a man like Kessler needs to speed up a foreclosure without anybody asking too many hard questions about the 11 that came before you. Imani sat down heavily on the porch step, the full shape of it settling over her, that a single act of kindness, feeding a hungry stranger, had somehow become the excuse a corrupt system needed to take the only thing she had left of her mother. I can't lose this house, she said, her voice breaking. It's not just a house, Mr. Halloran. It's the only place that still smells like her. It's the only— You're not losing this house, Rook said, and there was something in his voice now. Not comfort exactly, but certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from a man who has made a promise to himself and does not intend to break it. I made your mama a promise 14 years ago that I never got the chance to keep, he went on. I told her, laying in that hospital bed, that if she ever needed anything at all, the Iron Shepherds would move heaven and earth to get it to her. She wouldn't take my word for it then. Said, soldier, you don't owe me nothing. Just live your life. But she's not here to tell me no this time. He closed the folder and looked Imani dead in the eye. You said your mama's whole life was, we don't ask, we give. Well, sometimes, baby girl, receiving is the only way to honor a gift that was given to somebody else, a long time before you. You didn't ask for any of this, but I'm asking you, let us help. Imani opened her mouth to protest, the old reflex rising up automatic as breathing. I'm fine, I don't need— But she looked at the yellow notice still taped crooked to her refrigerator through the open door behind her, and thought of 11 days, and thought of her mother's voice. And for the first time in 3 years, she let the protest die in her throat. What do I need to do? She asked instead. Rook's face broke into the first real smile she'd seen from him. Nothing but be home Saturday morning, he said, before dawn, and maybe put on a pot of coffee. Because you're about to have company. He left her with the folder, copies of everything, he said, for when the reporter comes calling, and Imani spent the rest of that evening at her kitchen table, reading through it page by page under the yellow light of the stove hood, unable to stop even as it got late. 11 files, 11 families, the Odells on Fairview, who'd raised 3 children in a house now sitting boarded up and empty. An elderly couple on 3rd Street who'd lived there 41 years before a single, unexplained reassessment priced them out in 8 months flat. A single father, 2 neighborhoods over, who'd lost the only home his kids had ever known, and was now, according to a handwritten note clipped to his file, living out of a extended-stay motel off Route 4 with all 3 of them in one room. Each file was a photocopy of a life interrupted, a family blindsided by a system that was supposed to protect them and had instead, quietly and patiently, worked against them for years, while nobody with the power to stop it bothered to ask why so many modest paid-off homes on the same handful of streets kept ending up in county auction. By the time Imani closed the folder, it was past midnight, and something in her chest had shifted from what it had been that morning. This was no longer only about saving her mother's house. It was about a man who had built a quiet career out of preying on people too exhausted by simply surviving to notice they were being robbed one form, one signature, one market correction at a time. For the first time in 3 years, the fire rising up in Imani wasn't grief. It was resolve. Rook had ridden off hours before, engine steady this time. No chain about to throw. Imani stood at her window a long moment in the cooling night air, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in 3 years. Not the exhaustion of carrying everything alone. Hope. She didn't know yet that 50 miles away, a journalist named Naima Okonkwo, sharp-eyed, relentless, and no stranger to chasing down a good story about power abusing the powerless, had just received an anonymous tip from an Iron Shepherd contact, along with a folder eerily similar to the one now sitting on Imani's kitchen table. She didn't know that Dwight Kessler, sitting in his office that same evening, had just gotten a call from his brother-in-law Carl, nervous, agitated, asking why a reporter from Channel 7 had left 3 messages about assessment irregularities in East Dayton. And she certainly didn't know that in 2 days' time, before the sun came up on Saturday morning, 300 motorcycles were going to fill Cherry Blossom Lane from end to end. Not to threaten her, not to bring the trouble Phoebe Anderson had warned the whole street about, but to stand between her and everyone who had ever tried to take what belonged to her. All Imani knew, standing on her porch that Thursday evening with a folder full of 11 other families' stolen homes clutched to her chest, was that for the first time since her mother died, she was not facing this alone. And 2 doors down, behind her yellow curtains, Phoebe Anderson watched the big man's taillight disappear down the street, and felt, for reasons she wasn't ready to examine, the first small crack of doubt in the story she'd already decided to believe. The table no one expected. Saturday morning, 5:47 a.m. This is where we came in. Imani Beauvais stood on her porch in her pajama pants, hand pressed over her mouth, watching 300 motorcycles fill Cherry Blossom Lane from one end to the other, headlights blazing gold against the last of the dark sky. Engines idled in a low, steady rumble that felt less like noise now and more like a heartbeat, the whole street pulsing with it. Rook Halloran walked up her front steps first, a cardboard box balanced against his hip, and behind him came riders 2 and 3 at a time, each one carrying something: grocery bags, boxes, coolers, a stack of folded blankets, a 5-gallon jug of rice. An older woman in a leather vest patched with a small embroidered cross carried a crock-pot still warm from her own kitchen. A young man with a shaved head and kind eyes carried a case of bottled water like it weighed nothing at all. "Miss Beauvais," Rook said, setting the box down at her feet, "the Iron Shepherds don't forget a debt, and we sure don't forget the woman who saved one of our own on the other side of the world." Imani couldn't speak. She stood there, tears running freely now, as box after box after box came up her porch steps and lined themselves along the railing, down the steps, across the little front yard, more food than she had seen in that house in 3 years, more than she could have imagined needing. Up and down the street, porch lights were flicking on one by one. Neighbors who 2 days earlier had crossed to the other sidewalk rather than pass her house now stood in their doorways in bathrobes and curlers, staring at the spectacle unfolding in the pre-dawn light. 300 motorcycles, 300 riders, all of them here, all of them respectful, all of them quietly filling one young woman's yard with more generosity than the whole block had shown her in a year. Phoebe Anderson stood on her own porch 2 doors down, arms wrapped tight around herself against the morning chill, watching it all with an expression that had shifted, sometime in the last 48 hours, from suspicion into something closer to shame. It was nearly 6:30, the sky just beginning to blush pink over the rooftops, when a white sedan pulled up at the edge of the crowd of motorcycles, and a woman stepped out with a notepad in one hand and a cameraman trailing close behind. Naima Okonkwo had been a reporter for Channel 7 for 6 years, and in that time, she had learned exactly one lesson that mattered more than any journalism school could teach. The biggest stories in a city like Dayton were almost never the ones that made the evening news on their own. They were the ones somebody had to go looking for. One records request and one anonymous tip at a time. The folder Rook Halloran's contact had passed her 3 days earlier had kept her up 2 nights straight. 11 properties, 11 families. One assessor's signature appearing again and again on reassessments that spiked just high enough, just fast enough to push desperate homeowners into default. Followed every single time, within 6 months, by a sale to the same shell company. Meridian Row Partners, registered, she'd discovered after 4 hours digging through state business filings, to a man named Carl Whitfield, whose sister, public records showed, was married to Dwight Kessler. She'd confirmed everything twice. Cross-checked county assessment records against sale dates. Interviewed 2 of the 11 families who'd already lost their homes, both of whom described the same pattern Imani was living through right now. A sudden unexplained compliance review, an accelerated timeline, no real chance to appeal. She had her story. And she had, standing in the middle of Cherry Blossom Lane, surrounded by 300 motorcycles at dawn, the most visually unforgettable place in the city to break it. "Miss Beauvais," Naima said, approaching with her cameraman already rolling, "I'm sorry to catch you at a moment like this, but I think what's happening to your family is bigger than just your family. Would you be willing to talk to me on camera?" Imani looked past her, at the crowd of leather-clad strangers who had become, in the space of 4 days, something closer to family than most of the people she'd grown up around on this street. She looked at Rook, who gave her a small, steady nod. "Yes," Imani said, wiping her face, straightening her shoulders. "Yes, I'll talk." The story ran that same evening, first as breaking coverage on Channel 7's 6 o'clock broadcast, then picked up by wire services within hours, then shared and reshared across every corner of Dayton and beyond by morning. County assessor accused of targeting black homeowners in years-long scheme. Naima Okonkwo laid it out with the precision of a woman who had done her homework twice over. The 11 properties, the pattern of inflated assessments, the family connection to Meridian Row Partners, and Imani's case as the human center of it all. A 19-year-old caring for her sick grandmother, days from losing the only home her late mother had ever owned, targeted with an accelerated foreclosure timeline built on nothing but neighborhood gossip about a wounded veteran she'd helped at her own front door. By Sunday morning, the county had placed Dwight Kessler on administrative leave pending investigation. By Monday, the state auditor's office had opened a formal inquiry into assessment practices across the entire district, not just Kessler's 11 files, but every property he'd touched in 4 years. By Tuesday, Carl Whitfield had lawyered up, and Meridian Row Partners had gone suspiciously quiet on every deal currently in progress. And by Wednesday, standing in the parking lot outside the county building with a swarm of reporters, and, notably, several dozen iron shepherds parked in a silent, watchful line along the curb, Dwight Kessler was finally forced to face the cameras himself. He looked smaller than his memos had made him sound, smaller than the yellow notice he'd taped to Imani's door. He mumbled something about standard procedure and market corrections before his own attorney all but pulled him away from the microphones. Imani watched the clip later that night on Rook's phone, sitting on her own porch steps with Gran Solen's wheelchair parked beside her, the old woman wrapped in a blanket, watching with sharp, satisfied eyes. "Look at that," Gran Solen said, her voice thin but clear. "Sa u semen, se sa u recolte." What you sow, you reap. In the weeks between the broadcast and the hearing, life on Cherry Blossom Lane did not simply return to normal. It became something Imani hadn't known it could be. The boxes from that first Saturday morning had filled her kitchen, her hallway closet, even a corner of the small dining room she'd stopped using for anything but stacking mail years ago. But it wasn't just food. 2 iron shepherds who'd ridden trucks instead of bikes that morning turned out to be contractors by trade, and they spent the following Saturday replacing the rotted boards on her porch steps without being asked twice. A woman named Delphine, who rode with the club's Cincinnati chapter and had been a home health aide for 11 years, started stopping by twice a week to help with Gran Solen, bathing her, changing her linens, giving Imani 2 free afternoons a week she hadn't had since her mother died. "You don't have to do all this," Imani told Rook one evening, watching Delphine coax a rare, delighted laugh out of her grandmother in the next room. "I know. Rook said, echoing her own words back to her from that first Tuesday night. But your mama didn't have to feed a hurting soldier from a hospital cot in Germany either. Some debts don't get smaller just because time passes. They get heavier if you let them sit. It wasn't only the Iron Shepherds who showed up different in those weeks. New Hope Missionary Baptist, stirred by the broadcast and by a quiet private conversation Deacon Freeman had with his own conscience, revisited its benevolence fund and found, somehow, that there was more in it than anyone remembered. Enough, along with a modest settlement the county offered ahead of the state's full investigation, to clear the outstanding balance on Imani's property taxes entirely, with room to spare for the roof repairs that had been waiting, ignored, for 2 winters. Phoebe Anderson came to the porch one gray Thursday afternoon, a foil-covered dish of macaroni balanced in both hands, and stood at the bottom of the steps for a long, awkward moment before she found the words she'd clearly been rehearsing the whole walk over. "I said things about you I had no right to say," Phoebe told her, not quite meeting her eyes. "I let my own hurt turn into meanness toward you, and that wasn't fair. I lost my mama's house the same way you almost lost yours, and instead of standing with you, I stood against you. I'm sorry, Imani, truly." Imani had thought in the early days of the gossip that she might never be able to look at Phoebe Anderson without feeling the sting of it all over again. But standing there on her porch, watching a proud woman force herself to be small in the doorway of an apology, something in Imani softened despite itself. "Come on in, Miss Phoebe," she said finally, stepping back to let her through. "That macaroni's not going to eat itself." It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door left open, and sometimes, Imani was learning, that was where forgiveness started. It was Naima Okonkwo who arranged the final piece, a follow-up segment, filmed back on Cherry Blossom Lane, meant to show the human cost of what Kessler had done and the community's response to it. She asked Imani if she'd be willing to say something directly to Kessler, now formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and official misconduct, should the opportunity ever present itself. The opportunity presented itself 3 weeks later at a community accountability hearing held at New Hope Missionary Baptist Church itself, a hearing Kessler was legally required to attend as part of the county's response to the growing scandal, where affected families were invited to speak. The sanctuary was packed, every pew full. Deacon Otis Freeman sat near the front, next to Sister Verlene Doss, next to a dozen other neighbors who, in the weeks since the story broke, had come by Imani's porch one by one to apologize, to bring a casserole, to sit with Grand Solène a while. Phoebe Anderson sat near the back, hands folded tight in her lap, having asked Imani, quietly, privately, 2 days earlier, for forgiveness she hadn't fully expected to receive, but had needed, badly, to ask for anyway. And near the front, flanked by his lawyer, sat Dwight Kessler, looking at the floor. When it came time for Imani to speak, she rose from her seat, walked to the small podium set up near the altar, and unfolded a single sheet of paper she'd been writing and rewriting for 3 days. She had every right, everyone in that room understood, to tear the man apart, to list every sleepless night, every tear, every moment of fear his greed had cost her. Cameras were rolling. The whole city would see whatever she said next. Instead, Imani reached down beside the podium and lifted into view of the entire congregation Grand Solène's old blue enamel plate, the same one, chip on the rim and all, that she'd served Rook Halloran on that Tuesday night that started everything. It was full. Rice and beans, cooked slow, seasoned the way her mother had taught Gran and Gran had taught her. She walked it, in front of God and the cameras and the whole congregation, to where Dwight Kessler sat, and held it out to him. The sanctuary went dead silent. "Mr. Kessler," Imani said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "You tried to take the only thing my mother left me. You used lies about people who turned out to be the closest thing to family I have left. You did that to 11 other families before me, and I imagine you'd have done it to 11 more if a hungry, hurt stranger hadn't knocked on my door at the exact right moment." She held the plate out further. "But my mother raised me to believe something. We don't ask, we give, even to people who don't deserve it, especially to people who don't deserve it, because that's not about them, that's about who we choose to be." Kessler stared up at her, stunned, his lawyer frozen beside him, the whole room holding its breath. I'm not giving you this because I forgive what you did, Imani said. I don't, not yet, and maybe not for a long while. I'm giving it to you because I refuse to let what you tried to take from me turn me into somebody who forgets where I came from. My mother fed strangers her whole life. I'm not about to stop that streak on account of you. She set the plate down gently on the small table beside him and walked back to her seat, and the New Hope sanctuary erupted. Not into applause exactly, not at first, but into something quieter and more powerful. A low murmur of amens rolling pew to pew. Deacon Freeman on his feet, Sister Verline wiping her eyes, and near the back, Phoebe Anderson crying without trying to hide it anymore. Rook Halloran, standing along the back wall with a dozen fellow Iron Shepherds, pressed a fist briefly to his chest and bowed his head. Gran Solen, watching from her wheelchair in the front row, reached out and caught Imani's hand as she sat back down, squeezing it with more strength than her failing body had shown in months. "Manman Otapfia," she whispered. "Your mother would be proud." And for the first time since the accident 3 years ago, Imani let herself believe it might be true. That somewhere her mother was watching, not with grief for all that had been lost, but with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had raised her daughter exactly right. The state investigation would take months to fully resolve. Dwight Kessler would eventually plead guilty to multiple counts of fraud and official misconduct, agreeing to a sentence that included restitution to all 11 affected families. Carl Whitfield and Meridian Row Partners would face their own separate civil suit, filed jointly by the families whose homes had been taken, with Naima Okonkwo's reporting cited directly in the state's case. But none of that had happened yet. Not that Wednesday evening in the sanctuary of New Hope Missionary Baptist. What had happened, right there in front of the whole congregation, was smaller and larger at the same time. A young woman who had spent 3 years learning to carry everything alone, finally understanding that the strength her mother had given her was never meant to be carried in isolation. It was meant to be shared, the same way a plate of rice and beans, offered without hesitation to a stranger bleeding on her porch, had somehow found its way back around to save the very house it almost cost her. Imani didn't know it yet, walking out of that church with her grandmother's wheelchair and Rook Halloran's steady hand at her elbow, but the hardest part was already behind her. There was one more conversation that night, though, that Imani would carry with her longer than the plate, longer than the applause, longer than any of it. Rook found her on the church steps afterward, sitting alone for a moment while Delphine wheeled Gran Solen toward the fellowship hall for coffee and cake. He sat down beside her, ribs long since healed, and was quiet a while before he spoke. "Your mama ever tell you what she said to me, right before they wheeled me into surgery that night in Landstuhl?" he asked. Imani shook her head. "I was scared," Rook admitted, and there was no shame at all in the confession. Not from a man who'd survived 2 tours and a chest full of shrapnel. "Scared in a way. I hadn't let myself be scared the whole deployment. And your mama leaned down close and said, 'Fear is just love with nowhere to go yet. Point it somewhere. Point it at getting home to the people who need you.'" He looked out at the street, at the last of the Iron Shepherd's bikes still parked along the church lot, engines quiet now, waiting. "I've thought about that line most days for 14 years, he said. "Didn't understand it fully till I watched you hand that man his own plate back tonight instead of tearing into him the way he deserved. That's fear pointed somewhere good, Imani." That's exactly what she meant. Imani felt her eyes sting again, the tears different this time. Not grief, not fear, but something closer to gratitude, too large for her chest to hold comfortably. "I keep thinking she sent you," she said quietly. "That night your chain threw a mile from my house. I know that's not how the world works, but I keep thinking it anyway." Rook Halloran smiled, slow and certain, the porch light catching the gray in his beard. "Baby girl," he said, "after 14 years of dead ends looking for your mother, and then ending up bleeding on your porch out of every house on every street in this whole city, I've stopped ruling that out." He stood then, offering her his hand to help her up off the steps, and together they walked toward the fellowship hall, toward the smell of coffee and cake and the low, warm hum of a community putting itself back together, one apology and one open door at a time. What waited on Cherry Blossom Lane 3 days later was something none of them, not Imani, not Rook, not even Gran Solen with all her quiet certainty, could have fully imagined. 300 boxes and 1 plate. 3 days after the hearing at New Hope, on a Saturday morning much like the one that started everything, Imani Beauvais woke before her alarm, the way she always did, out of habit built over 3 long years of carrying a house on her shoulders. Except this time, when she pulled back the curtain in her bedroom, the weight wasn't there anymore. She lay still a moment, listening to the quiet. No tax notice taped to the refrigerator, no 11-day countdown ticking in the back of her mind, no envelope waiting to be opened with hands that shook. The county had formally dismissed the accelerated foreclosure the week prior. The back taxes were paid in full, the roof repairs already scheduled, and Dwight Kessler was, as of 2 days ago, formally charged and awaiting trial, his career and his freedom both hanging by threads he'd woven himself, one inflated assessment at a time. Imani rose, dressed, and went to check on Gran Solen, and found her already awake, sitting up in bed with more color in her cheeks than Imani had seen in months, humming softly to herself in Creole. "You're up early, Gran," Imani said, smiling. "Big day today, chérie," Gran Solen said, eyes twinkling in a way that told Imani her grandmother knew something she didn't. She found out what exactly at 5:47 that morning, the exact hour to the minute that had started it all 4 weeks earlier. But before that morning arrived, there was one more piece of the story that needed finishing. A piece Imani hadn't expected, and wouldn't learn the full shape of until Rook sat her down 2 nights before, at her own kitchen table, with a look on his face she'd come to recognize as the look he wore right before he told her something that would change everything again. Kessler's lawyer reached out to the county, Rook had told her, turning a coffee mug slowly between his big hands. Trying to negotiate his plea down, offered up something in exchange. "What kind of something?" "Names," Rook said. "Turns out Whitfield wasn't just flipping the 11 houses on my list. There's a 12th family, the Odells out on Fairview, whose case never made it into the file because the paperwork got buried different. Kessler's offering it up to shave time off his sentence, which means the Odells might get their house back too if the county moves fast enough before Meridian Row unloads it." Imani sat with that a long moment. 12 families now, not 11. 12 stories just like her own. 12 empty kitchens. 12 people who'd learned to carry more than they should have to carry alone. "That could have been any of us," she said quietly. "Any of us on this whole street." "That's exactly why it can't just stop with you getting your house back," Rook said. "That's why Saturday's happening the way it's happening. This isn't just about paying your mama's debt no more, Imani. It's about making sure Cherry Blossom Lane never has to learn this lesson the hard way again." She hadn't fully understood what he meant by that. Not until Saturday morning came, and she stepped out onto her porch to find out exactly how far one Iron Shepherd's promise could stretch when 300 people decided to keep it together. Imani stepped out onto her porch in the gray pre-dawn light and stopped dead in her tracks. Cherry Blossom Lane was full again. Motorcycles lined the street from one end to the other, headlights blazing gold against the dark, engines rumbling low and steady. That same heartbeat sound that had once terrified her half-asleep neighbors, and now, 4 weeks later, felt like the most welcome sound in the world. But this time, it wasn't only the Iron Shepherds. Deacon Otis Freeman stood on his own porch 2 houses down, already dressed for church despite the early hour, a card table folded under one arm. Sister Verlaine Doss was crossing her lawn with a stack of folding chairs. Phoebe Anderson, in an apron over her church clothes, was already setting a tray of biscuits on the low wall at the edge of Imani's yard. Naima Okonkwo stood near the curb with her cameraman, filming not for a breaking news segment this time, but for what she'd later describe, in the gentler follow-up piece that aired the next week, as the kind of story Dayton needed to see. And running the length of the entire block, porch to porch, curb to curb, were tables. Dozens of them, borrowed from the church fellowship hall, from neighbors' garages, from the Iron Shepherd's own clubhouse 40 minutes out of town, all pushed end to end to form one impossibly long table stretching the whole length of Cherry Blossom Lane. 300 cardboard boxes lined the tables and the yards and the porches on either side, The same kind of box Rook had carried up her steps 4 weeks earlier, except now there were 300 of them, filled not just for Imani's house, but for every family on the block who needed a little extra that month. Every widow, every struggling young mother, every elder living alone on a fixed income who'd been too proud to ask. Rook Halloran stood at the center of it all, and when he saw Imani step out onto the porch, he smiled the same slow, certain smile she'd first seen on him that very first Tuesday night. "We figured," he called up to her, "that one house's worth of grace was a good start. But your mama didn't raise you to keep a good thing to yourself. Figured it was time the whole street learned that lesson, too." Imani walked down her porch steps in her bare feet, the same way she had that very first night, and Rook met her halfway across the yard, holding something out to her. Gran Solen's blue enamel plate, the one Imani had carried into that church hearing 3 days earlier, the one she'd handed to Dwight Kessler full of rice and beans in front of the whole congregation. Someone had cleaned it, polished the old enamel until it gleamed and filled it again. This time not out of scarcity, not as the last of anything, but as the first course of a feast the whole community had gathered to share. "Figured this belonged back with you," Rook said, setting it gently into her hands. "Where it started." Imani looked down at the plate. Same chip on the rim, same faded blue, carrying now the weight of everything that had happened since the last time she'd filled it in that empty kitchen. She thought of her mother's hands, years ago in Port-au-Prince, spooning rice onto this very plate for a hungry neighbor's child. She thought of Gran Solen, teaching a scared 16-year-old how to stretch a little food into a lot of love. She thought of herself, 4 weeks ago, giving away the last of everything to a bleeding stranger because some things mattered more than fear. We don't ask, we give. And now, standing in a street full of people who had given right back, bikers and deacons, reporters and once hostile neighbors, all gathered around 300 boxes of grace, Imani finally understood the rest of what her mother had never gotten the chance to teach her. We give. And sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're patient, if we let ourselves be loved the way we love others, it comes back around. Somewhere in the middle of the morning, while Delphine helped Gran Solen settle at the head table, Rook pulled Imani aside toward the edge of the yard, near where his motorcycle sat parked exactly where it had broken down 4 weeks before. "Got something else for you," he said, and from his saddlebag he produced a thick envelope, official county letterhead visible through the paper. Imani opened it with careful fingers and found inside a deed, not to her own house, which was already secure, but to the small lot 2 doors down that had sat vacant and overgrown since the county seized it in a foreclosure years before anyone on the block could quite remember. The lot backed right up against the Andersons' fence line. "County's converting it to community use," Rook explained. "Part of the settlement the state's pushing through after everything Naima uncovered. Whitfield's civil suit is funding a restitution fund for all 12 families, and the Iron Shepherds put in the rest to turn this lot into something the whole street can use. A garden, a gathering space, whatever y'all decide together. Deacon Freeman's already talking about tomato beds. Phoebe wants a swing set for when the Odell kids move back in." Imani stared at the paper in her hands, then out at the street full of people who had been strangers to each other in some cases, and strangers to her in others, only weeks before. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, for what felt like the 100th time since that first Tuesday night. "No," Rook agreed, echoing himself now too. "But your mama fed a dying soldier from a hospital cot without knowing if she'd ever get so much as a thank you back. Some things you do because they're right, not because they're owed. This is just interest on a debt that's been compounding 14 years, baby girl. Take it graciously and let an old man feel useful." Imani laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself have much of in 3 long years, and hugged him hard enough that he grunted in mock protest about his ribs, fully healed now, but still, apparently, fair game for a joke between them. They set up long tables that morning right there on Cherry Blossom Lane, and by 7 o'clock the whole street smelled like a celebration. Biscuits and gravy from Phoebe's kitchen, jerk chicken smoking on a grill somebody's cousin from the Iron Shepherds' Jamaica-born president had insisted on bringing, a dozen different kinds of rice and beans, from a dozen different kitchens, each family's own version of the dish that had started it all. Gran Solène held court from her wheelchair at the head of the longest table, a plate of her own in her lap, telling stories about Marie Claude to anyone who'd sit still long enough to listen. How she'd fed half the block during a blackout in '09. How she'd once given her own coat to a stranger at a bus stop in the middle of a Dayton winter and walked home shivering rather than let the woman freeze. "That's where the girl gets it," Gran said, nodding toward Imani, who sat 2 seats down between Rook and Delphine, laughing at something Deacon Freeman had said. "Some things they don't skip a generation. They just wait for the right moment to show themselves." Midway through the meal, a car none of them recognized pulled slowly to the curb at the edge of all the motorcycles, and a thin woman in her 60s stepped out, hesitant, scanning the crowd like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Beside her, a boy of about 10 hung back near the car door, clutching a battered backpack to his chest. Rook was the one who noticed first. He rose from the table and crossed the yard, and Imani watched him speak with the woman a long moment before he turned and waved Imani over. "Imani," Rook said, "this is Miss Odalis Odell, and this young man is her grandson, Marcus." The name landed like a stone dropped in still water. The Odells, the 12th family. The name Rook had mentioned at her kitchen table 2 nights before. "We heard what happened here," Odalis Odell said, her voice unsteady. "Heard about the reporter and the hearing and—" She stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment before continuing. "The county called us Thursday, said they're reversing our foreclosure, said we might get our house back within the month, on account of everything that got uncovered because of what happened to you." Imani felt her own eyes sting, thinking of a family she'd never met, living through the exact same nightmare on a different street. Saved by a chain reaction that had started with a bowl of rice and beans on a Tuesday night, she still could hardly believe had really happened. "We didn't have anywhere else we felt right going today," Odalis admitted. "Didn't want to intrude, but Marcus here, he wanted to say thank you himself. Insisted on it, actually." The boy stepped forward, shy, clutching his backpack strap, and looked up at Imani with the particular seriousness only a child carrying something important can manage. "My grandma cried for 2 days when we got the letter that said we might get our room back," Marcus said. "I just wanted to say thank you for being brave enough that it helped us too, even though you don't even know us." Imani knelt down to his eye level, throat too tight for a moment to answer. "You know what?" she finally managed. "Somebody I never met was brave enough, 14 years ago, halfway around the world, that it ended up helping me too. That's just how it works sometimes. Come on. There's plenty of food, and I think Deacon Freeman's about to tell his story about the 4th of July blackout again, and you do not want to miss that one." Marcus grinned, the seriousness melting off him all at once the way it does with children, and ran off toward the tables with the easy confidence of a boy who'd just been told, in the clearest way possible, that he was welcome. Odalis Odell watched him go, then turned back to Imani, gripping both her hands tight. "Your mother," she said. "Whoever she was, whatever she taught you, I hope you know it didn't stop with you. It's already reaching people you'll never even meet." Naima Okonkwo's follow-up piece ran the following week under a very different headline than her first story. Not an exposé this time, but something gentler. A portrait of a street that had nearly torn itself apart with fear and gossip and found its way back to each other instead. The clip of Imani handing Rook that very first plate, back on a security camera Phoebe's own porch had happened to catch that original Tuesday night, played alongside footage of 300 motorcycles lining the same street a month later. Not as a threat this time, but as a promise kept. The story spread far beyond Dayton. Comments poured in from strangers across the country. Some who'd lost their own homes to systems that didn't care, some who'd been shown unexpected kindness by people they'd been taught to fear, some who simply wanted to say that watching a girl give away her last meal and get an entire community back in return had restored something in them they hadn't realized they'd lost. That evening, after the tables were folded away and the last of the Iron Shepherd's engines had faded down the road, Imani sat alone on her porch steps, The same steps where she'd first found Rook bleeding 4 weeks earlier, the blue plate resting clean and empty in her lap. The house behind her was quiet. Gran Solen settled into bed, tired and happy in a way Imani hadn't seen from her in years. The porch light overhead buzzed the same familiar buzz it always had. Down the street, someone's screen door slammed, ordinary and unremarkable, the sound of a neighborhood simply being a neighborhood again. Imani looked down at the plate in her hands. The same plate, the same chip on the rim, carrying now 4 generations of women who'd learned the same lesson in different kitchens, on different continents, in different kinds of scarcity. Her great-grandmother in Port-au-Prince, Gran Solen, Marie-Claude, and now her. We don't ask. We give. But she understood something now that none of them, maybe, had fully understood in their own hardest moments. That giving wasn't supposed to be a lonely act. That her mother's generosity hadn't been meant to be carried in isolation, passed down like a burden instead of a gift. That somewhere along the way, in 3 years of grief and pride and doing it all alone, Imani had forgotten the other half of the lesson. You give. And you let yourself receive, too, when the moment comes. Both halves matter. Neither one works without the other. So here's the question. This old street, and this young woman, and one hungry stranger on a broken-down motorcycle left us with, the night the last plate of food in an empty house became the first plate of a feast for 300. When was the last time you gave something away, not because you had plenty, but because someone needed it more than you did, and trusted that somehow, some way, it would find its way back around? Maybe it already has. Maybe you're still waiting on it, the way Imani waited 3 long years without even knowing help was already 14 years down the road looking for her family's door. Either way, hold on to this. The kindness you offer when you have the least to give is very rarely wasted. It has a way of finding its way home, sometimes on the back of 300 motorcycles, sometimes in a knock on the door you least expect. If this story moved you tonight, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and who taught you that giving isn't about how much you have. It's about who you choose to be, even when you have nothing left to spare. And if you know somebody who needs to hear that tonight, somebody carrying more than they should be carrying alone, go on and share this with them. Some debts take 14 years to repay, but they always, always come due. The end.